It started with a wedding gift turned murder weapon, a string of pearls pulled tight around a queen's throat. It ended 40 years later, with an 80-year-old woman torn apart by a wild horse. In between lay a kingdom where two rival queens played a deadly game of chess, using their own husbands and children as pawns to be sacrificed. This isn't a fairy tale, it is the most brutal blood feud in history, where the only true winner was death itself. In the chambers, heavy with the scent of frankincense and decaying lilies, Queen Galswintha was found lifeless. The air itself was a shroud, thick and still, muffling the morning light that strained through the high, narrow windows. The silence was profound, a vacuum where the life of a queen had been only hours before. It clung to the heavy tapestries depicting hunts and forgotten battles, their woven figures now silent witnesses to a far more intimate and bloodless conquest. Upon the vast expanse of the royal bed, she lay as if in repose, an effigy carved from ivory. The silk sheets, embroidered with the symbols of her Visigothic lineage, were undisturbed, showing no sign of struggle. Her pale hands were crossed peacefully over her chest, a final, unknowing act of piety. Only the unnatural stillness and the faint blue tint of her lips betrayed the peace as a lie, a carefully constructed facade over a brutal truth that had stolen the breath from her body. The instrument of her demise was a string of pearls, a wedding gift from the very king who now mourned her with such convenient haste. The lustrous orbs were embedded deeply into the soft, white flesh of her throat, a stark and opulent garrote. Death had not come with the clamor of a sword or the rush of a blade, it had crept in quietly, a whisper in the dark, leaving behind only a cold body and a lingering, unanswerable question that hung in the air like dust motes in the light. King Chilperic arrived without ceremony, his footsteps echoing in the sudden emptiness of the royal suite. His face was a mask of practiced grief, his eyes sweeping the scene with a cold, appraising glance that saw everything and revealed nothing. There was no outcry, no collapse of a bereaved husband, only the rigid posture of a monarch assessing a situation. He stood over the bed for a long moment, a statue of sorrow, while his mind moved with the cold precision of a chess master. He reached out a hand, not to caress a final time the cheek of his departed wife, but to touch the pearls at her throat, his fingers clinical and detached. The court physician, summoned from his sleep, dared not speak, merely nodding as the king confirmed the obvious. The order to remove the body was given in a low, even tone, a command that dismissed not just a corpse, but an inconvenient alliance and a life that had served its purpose. The chapter of the Visigothic queen was closed with chilling finality. A tremor of whispers slithered through the palace corridors, spreading from the kitchens to the great hall like a contagion. Servants moved with their eyes downcast, their silence more telling than any spoken word. Nobles gathered in shadowed alcoves, their faces grim, their voices hushed as a single name passed between them. The name was Friedgund, the queen's handmaiden, a woman of low birth whose ambition was a fire that warmed itself on the misfortunes of others. From behind a heavy arras, she had watched the king's performance, her dark eyes missing nothing. There was no triumph on her face, only a deep, unnerving calm. She was a hunter who had waited patiently for her moment, her presence in the palace a slow-acting poison that had finally reached the heart of the kingdom. The transfer of power was not yet complete, but in the stillness of her gaze, the certainty of it was absolute and terrifying. Galswintha's funeral was a perfunctory affair, rushed and devoid of genuine sorrow. The rites were observed, the prayers were chanted, but the heart of the court was already moving on. The kingdom held its breath, feigning a grief it did not feel, while it waited for the king's next move. The speed with which events unfolded left no room for mourning, it was a brutal severing of the past, making way for a future that had been decided long before the queen's last breath. 3 days had not yet passed, the funereal incense barely cleared from the chapel, when the king announced his intention to marry again. A collective, silent shock rippled through the nobility. The indecency was breathtaking, a flagrant disregard for tradition and respect. King Chilperic would take Friedgund as his wife, elevating the servant to the throne that was not yet cold from the body of her predecessor. The whispers in the corridors now became a low, fearful murmur. The servant's coarse wool was exchanged for the finest silks, her unbound hair now intricately braided and bejeweled. As she stood before the silver mirror, she saw not the reflection of a maid, but the nascent image of a queen. Her beauty was dark and sharp, her eyes holding the glint of polished stone. She felt no remorse, only the satisfying weight of a destiny she had seized with her own 2 hands, a destiny paid for by another silent, suffocating end. In the solemnity of the royal chapel, King Chilperic placed the crown upon her dark hair. It was the same crown Galswintha had worn, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed to hold the warmth of the woman who had been so recently discarded. The gesture was not one of love, but of confirmation, a sealing of a pact made in shadows and secured by a string of pearls. The assembled court watched in a tense, unwilling silence. As she turned to face the nobles, now her subjects, her expression was unreadable. Her eyes, the color of a gathering storm, swept across the faces before her, acknowledging their fear and their silent condemnation with a look of utter indifference. She did not smile. She did not need to. A new reign had begun, born not of succession or conquest, but of a quiet act of violence in a perfumed room, and its queen ruled from a throne built upon a silent grave. The news arrived on the breath of the first autumn wind, a chill messenger that stripped the last defiant leaves from the trees. It traveled north to Austrasia, a rumor that solidified into hard fact as it crossed the border, carried by a rider who had galloped his horse into the ground. He brought with him the scent of death from another kingdom, a poison that now tainted the crisp, clean air of Metz. A lone horseman, a specter of mud and exhaustion, was a stark interruption to the day. He did not carry a banner of war, but the sealed scroll he bore was a declaration of a different, more insidious kind of conflict. His face was a mask of grim duty, his eyes holding the reflection of the tragedy he had left behind in Neustria, a kingdom now ruled by a servant girl with a crown. The portcullis of the royal castle rose with a groaning complaint, admitting the harbinger into the stone heart of Brunhilde's domain. The courtyard fell silent as he dismounted, every stable hand and guard sensing that the parchment in his gauntlet was heavier than its slight weight suggested. It was a burden, a seed of darkness planted in foreign soil, destined to grow into a forest of sorrow. Inside the great hall, the afternoon was a study in ordered tranquility. Brunhilde sat not on her throne but by a vast tapestry, her fingers tracing the path of a woven hunt. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. It was a scene of domestic royalty, a peace that was about to be irrevocably shattered by a few lines of ink on vellum. The messenger was brought before her, his weary steps echoing in the sudden hush. He fell to one knee, his breath a ragged cloud in the chilled air. He offered the scroll, the wax seal of her brother-in-law, Chilperic, unbroken. It was a formal courtesy, a thin veneer of respectability masking the obscene truth that lay coiled within the rolled parchment. Brunhilde took the scroll, her movements measured and deliberate. The court watched, their own breathing suspended. Her fingers, accustomed to the fineness of thread, broke the wax seal with a soft snap that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. She unrolled the vellum, her gaze sweeping across the hurried script, absorbing the words that would redefine her world. The ink seemed to bleed on the page, the words themselves becoming instruments of violence. Galswintha. Dead. A string of pearls. An accident in her sleep. The official lies were transparent, flimsy veils over a murder as cold and calculated as the winter that was now descending upon the land. Each word was a stone dropped into the calm waters of her soul. And then, the final sentence, an addendum of such breathtaking audacity that it was its own confession. The king, in his grief, had found solace in the arms of Galswintha's loyal handmaiden, Friedgund. He had married her. The servant was now the queen. The murderer now wore the victim's crown. The world tilted on its axis, and the fire in the hearth seemed to grow suddenly cold. She did not weep. No cry escaped her lips, no gasp of horror or pain. She simply stood, the scroll held loosely in her hand, her face as impassive as the carved stone saints that looked down from the chapel walls. The court held its breath, waiting for the storm of royal grief, but none came. There was only a terrifying stillness, a calm more unsettling than any rage. Her grief was a thing of ice, a frozen lake formed in an instant within her. On its surface, there was only a smooth, reflective stillness, a facade of unbreakable composure. But beneath that placid, unyielding surface, a dark and frigid current churned with a force that could grind mountains into dust. It was a grief too vast for tears, a rage too profound for words. With a slight, almost imperceptible gesture of her hand, she dismissed the court. The nobles and ladies in waiting retreated, their rustling silks and soft footsteps a timid tide receding from an unmovable shore. They left her alone in the great hall, a solitary figure dwarfed by the cavernous space, the damning scroll still in her hand. The messenger had already been led away, his part in the tragedy complete. She walked not to the chapel to pray for her sister's soul, but to her own private chambers. Her steps were even, unhurried, the walk of a woman going to a predetermined appointment. The heavy oak door closed behind her, shutting out the world and sealing her inside with the nascent monster that was awakening in the depths of her frozen grief. The silence in the room was absolute. Her chamber was a cell of shadows and fading light. A disk of polished silver, serving as a mirror, hung upon one wall, its surface cool and remote. She moved towards it, drawn by an impulse she did not understand. She needed to see the face of the woman who had just received such news, to find the sister, the wife, the queen she had been only moments before. She stood before the silver, staring at the muted, ghostly reflection it offered. The face that stared back was a stranger's mask, worn by a woman she no longer recognized. The softness around the eyes had hardened into chips of flint. The curve of her mouth, once quick to smile, was now a thin, straight line of resolve. The blood of Visigothic kings ran in her veins, a lineage not of victims, but of warriors. The reflection did not show a grieving sister. It showed an executioner. It showed a strategist. It showed a woman who had just been handed a cause that would consume her life and the lives of everyone she loved and hated. In that moment, looking into her own cold eyes, Brunhilde understood that her sister's death was not an end, but a beginning. It was the first move in a game she was now destined to play. Revenge was too simple a word for the feeling that was crystallizing within her. What she envisioned was a reckoning, a meticulous and patient dismantling of an entire lineage. Friedgund had taken a sister. In return, Brunhilde would take everything. Husbands, sons, grandsons. She would salt the very earth of Neustria with the blood of Fredegund's kin until the name was a curse spoken only in whispers. This would not be a war of banners and trumpets, fought by armies on a muddy field. That was the clumsy, artless work of men. Her war would be fought in the shadows, in the birthing rooms and the banquet halls. Its weapons would be a whisper of slander, a drop of poison in a cup of wine, a loyal assassin's dagger in the dark. It would be a war of queens, intimate and infinitely more cruel. The vow was made in silence, a pact with the cold-eyed woman in the mirror. It would not be sworn on a holy relic, but on the memory of a pearl necklace tightening on a soft throat. Her loyalty was no longer to a husband or a kingdom, but to a singular, all-consuming purpose. She would become a force of nature, as patient and as relentless as a glacier, carving her vengeance into the very landscape of the Frankish kingdoms. This war would not be won in a season or a year. It would be her life's work, a legacy of hatred to be passed down to her son, and his sons after him. The children of Friedgund would be born into this conflict, inheriting a blood feud they did not start but would be forced to finish. For 40 years, or 50, however long it took, the two queens would turn the world into their personal chessboard. She finally let the scroll fall from her fingers. It drifted to the floor, a meaningless artifact of a life that was now over. The life of Brunhilde, sister of Galswintha, had ended. The life of Brunhilde, the Avenger, had just begun. She turned away from the mirror, the stranger's face now her own, and walked back towards the door, ready to give her first command in a war that had already been declared. 10 years passed. A decade slid by not in the peaceful turning of seasons, but in the silent, grinding friction of two queens sharpening their hatred. The war was an invisible pestilence, corrupting the kingdoms from within. It was a conflict not of armies clashing on open fields, but of suspicions festering in the close air of the court. It was fought in the lingering gaze of a courtier, the sudden friendship of a lady-in-waiting, the gift of a fine wine. Every feast held the possibility of a poisoned dish, every hunt the chance of a stray arrow finding a royal target. Trust was the first casualty, a luxury no one in power could afford. The very air in the palaces of Metz and Soissons grew thick with it. Fredegund's beauty, in this venomous climate, had not withered, it had bloomed into a predatory flower. Time had refined her features, sharpening the intelligence in her storm-colored eyes. She wore her power not like a crown, but like a second skin, moving through the Neustrian court with a grace that mesmerized and terrified in equal measure. Her smile was a political weapon. Her true work was done in the shadows. She cultivated a garden of assassins, men whose desperation or greed made them pliable tools in her hands. They were ghosts, drawn from the dregs of the kingdom and given a singular, holy purpose, to carry her will into the heart of Austrasia. Their daggers were her emissaries, their poisoned tips her diplomatic seal. The target was the heart of her rival's strength, Brunhilde's husband, King Sigebert. Fredegund understood that to wound Brunhilde was not enough. To truly break her, she had to isolate her, to strip away her husband, her protector, the father of her heir. She would make Brunhilde a widow, just as she had made herself a queen through widowhood. While her agents plotted against her foreign enemy, her vigilance at home was absolute. The throne of Neustria, she knew, was not truly secure for her own son as long as Chilperic's other sons, her stepsons, still drew breath. They were living reminders of a time before her, their very existence a challenge to her legitimacy and her child's future. One by one, they began to meet unfortunate ends. The eldest, Theudebert, fell in battle, a predictable but convenient death. The second, Merovec, was a different problem, his gaze holding a spark of defiance. His fate would require more intricate planning, a slower, more personal destruction that would serve as a lesson to any who might rally behind him. Clovis, the youngest of the first wife's sons, was removed by a sudden, wasting sickness that baffled the royal physicians. His death was declared a tragedy, a sorrowful act of God. Fredegund mourned with the most convincing tears, a black-clad pieta of calculated grief, all while knowing the sickness had been administered by a trusted servant, a drop at a time, over many weeks. With each small coffin lowered into the royal crypt, the path for her own son became clearer. She was methodically pruning the family tree, cutting away the branches that blocked the sun from her chosen heir. Her maternal devotion was a terrible, consuming fire, and she would burn down the world to ensure her child's inheritance. The kingdom was being cleansed for her bloodline. Meanwhile, in Austrasia, Brunhilde and Sigebert ruled a court that felt like a fortress under siege. Sigebert was a strong king, a warrior who had expanded his borders and won the loyalty of his nobles. He loved his wife, seeing in her a spirit of iron that matched his own. Together, they presented a united front, a bastion of power against Neustria's encroaching shadows. Brunhilde was not the same woman who had stared into a silver mirror 10 years prior. The Avenger had become a stateswoman. She learned the languages of diplomacy and intrigue, her mind a sharp ledger of alliances and enmities. She matched Fredegund's spies with her own, her network of informants spreading like mycelium beneath the forest floor of the Frankish courts. But Fredegund's hatred was a more focused, more primal force. Brunhilde fought for her kingdom and her family, Fredegund fought for her own survival and the supremacy of her son. This gave her a clarity of purpose, a willingness to risk everything on a single, decisive strike. The opportunity came when Sigebert, flush with victory, had pushed deep into Neustrian territory. He had cornered his brother Chilperic, the long-simmering war of attrition finally breaking out into open conflict. Sigebert's army was superior, his victory all but certain. In his camp at Vitry, he was hailed as the sole king of the Franks. It was a moment of supreme triumph, the culmination of a decade of struggle. And it was in this moment of glory that his guard was at its lowest. Fredegund did not send an army to meet him. She sent 2 men. They came to his tent under a flag of truce, pretending to be defectors, nobles ready to abandon Chilperic and swear fealty to the victor. They were granted an audience, their humble petition a mask for the cold purpose that beat in their hearts. They knelt before the triumphant king. As they rose, they did not offer fealty. They offered death. From their sleeves, they produced short, broad daggers known as scramsaxes. The blades were coated with a dark, viscous substance, a poison for which there was no antidote. Before Sigebert's guards could react, the 2 assassins lunged, striking him in the sides. The wounds were not deep, but they were fatal. The king fell without a sound, his eyes wide with a final, stark understanding. The victory celebration turned into a funeral dirge. The assassins were cut down immediately, their deaths ensuring their silence, but their mission was complete. The heart had been ripped from the Austrasian kingdom. The triumphant army, now leaderless, dissolved into chaos and retreated. News of the assassination reached Brunhilde not by a formal messenger, but as a terrified, fractured rumor that solidified into an unbearable truth. Her husband was dead. Her victory was ashes. In a single moment, she was no longer the wife of the most powerful king in Gaul. She was a widow, a foreigner in a hostile land, with only a 5-year-old son at her side. The frozen lake of her grief, formed a decade ago, did not thaw. Instead, the ice cracked, a deep, shuddering fissure that exposed the black, violent water beneath. The calculated coldness of the avenger was now joined by the raw fury of the cornered wolf, a mother protecting her cub. Her war was no longer an affair of state, it was now purely, terrifyingly personal. In Neustria, Friedgund received the news with a quiet, profound satisfaction. She had turned Sigebert's greatest victory into his tomb. She had widowed her hated rival, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Now, with Austrasia in disarray, she could turn her full attention to the last of her stepsons, and to cementing a dynasty that would be built entirely upon the bones of her enemies. In the chaos that followed Sigebert's murder, the Austrasian kingdom fractured like a dropped mirror. The victorious army, suddenly headless, dissolved into a panicked mob. In this maelstrom of fear and confusion, Brunhilde was no longer a queen commanding loyalty, but a valuable piece of plunder to be claimed. She was captured swiftly, a spoil of a war won by assassins. Her 5-year-old son, Childebert, the new king, was a different matter. A loyal duke, seeing the tide turn, snatched the boy and vanished into the forests, a tiny, golden-haired legacy spirited away from the wreckage. Brunhilde was taken to Rouen, a trophy for Chilperic, a gift to be laid at the feet of the architect of her ruin, Queen Friedgund. She entered her captivity not in sackcloth and ashes, but with the unbent posture of her Visigothic ancestors. Her head was held high, her gaze sweeping over her captors with a cold contempt that unnerved them more than any tears or pleas for mercy. She did not beg. She did not bargain. She simply endured, her silence a weapon they did not know how to counter. Her prison was a tower room, comfortable and well-appointed. It was a gilded cage, designed not for punishment but for observation. Friedgund wanted her rival alive, a symbol of Neustrian dominance, a broken eagle to be paraded when necessary. But in this, she made a grave miscalculation. She had caged a lioness, not a songbird, and had given her time to think. Brunhilde did not succumb to despair. She turned her confinement into a study. From her window, she watched the life of the city. From the servants who brought her meals, she gleaned whispers of the court. She learned the currents of power, the factions, the rivalries. Her prison became her university of Neustrian politics, and she was a very dedicated student. She transformed her cell into a stage, and herself into its sole, captivating actor. She was the wronged widow, the noble queen betrayed, the grieving mother torn from her child. Her performance was flawless, a subtle masterpiece of dignity and sorrow. She projected an aura of tragic grace that began to work on those who guarded her, a slow, methodical enchantment. Her most crucial audience was a man she had not anticipated. Merivek, Chilperic's son from his first marriage and Fredegund's surviving stepson, was sent to Rouen by his father. He was the nephew of the men Brunhilde mourned, and the son of the men who held her captive. He was a young man caught between warring houses, living in the shadow of a stepmother who despised him. He came to her tower room out of a sense of duty, perhaps, or a morbid curiosity to see the infamous Austrasian queen. What he found was not the monster of Fredegund's tales, but a woman of breathtaking composure and intelligence. He saw not an enemy, but a fellow victim of his stepmother's ambition. He recognized in her a shared vulnerability. Brunhilde saw him, and in an instant, she understood his value. He was not a boy, he was a key. He was a path out of her cage, a weapon to be turned against his own family. She focused all her considerable charm, all her intellect, all her carefully managed sorrow upon him. She did not seduce a boy, she recruited an ally with the promise of a future. She spoke to him of Austrasia, of the loyalty of its nobles to her son. She painted a picture of a kingdom that could be his, a crown to be won. She made him see a future where he was not a threatened stepson cowering before Friedgund, but a king in his own right, allied with the most formidable woman in the Frankish kingdoms. She offered him not just love, but power. Merivek, young and ambitious, and already living in daily fear of his stepmother's plots, was utterly captivated. He fell in love not just with the woman, but with the idea of her, with the destiny she offered him. He saw in their union an act of glorious rebellion, a way to secure his own life and seize a throne. He was a moth drawn to a magnificent, dangerous flame. In secret, defying the will of his father and the certain wrath of his stepmother, they were married. A sympathetic bishop, Pretextatus of Rouen, performed the ceremony in the dead of night. The act was a masterstroke of political theater. By marrying the king's son, Brunhilde the prisoner was transformed into Brunhilde the Neustrian princess. Her status was now unassailably complex. The news of the marriage sent Chilperic into a rage. Friedgund was incandescent with fury. Her carefully laid plans were in ruins. Not only had her stepson defied her, but he had allied himself with her mortal enemy, giving the captured queen a legitimate position within their own court. She had wanted to break Brunhilde, but had instead handed her a sword. The marriage was her escape. With Maraveka's help, she fled Rouen, leaving her new, hapless husband to face his father's wrath alone. She traveled swiftly and secretly, a shadow moving across the land, her destination the one place she still had power, Austrasia. It was not an escape, but a return. She was going home to reclaim her son, her throne, and her war. Her arrival in Metz was a resurrection. To the Austrasian nobles who had feared her lost, she was a returning symbol of their kingdom's defiance and legitimacy. She was no longer just the foreign wife of their dead king, she was a heroine who had entered the heart of the enemy's camp and emerged with a tactical victory, a survivor forged in the fires of captivity. She immediately took control. Her son, Childebert II, was a child, but she was a formidable regent. She gathered the reins of power with a skill that left the ambitious nobles in awe. She used her ordeal to command loyalty, her intelligence to outmaneuver her rivals, and her unwavering will to forge the fractured kingdom back into a unified force. Her rule was absolute, her purpose singular. The education of her son became her most vital project. His lessons were not of scripture or philosophy, but of history, a history written in his father's blood. She taught him the names of his enemies before she taught him the names of the saints. His bedtime stories were chronicles of Fredegund's treachery. She poured the venom of her own hatred into the vessel of his youth. The war against Neustria was presented to him not as a political conflict, but as a sacred duty, a filial obligation to avenge his murdered father. The feud was no longer a personal vendetta between two women, it became the official, guiding policy of the Austrasian state. This poison was her legacy, a gift she would later pass to her grandsons when she became regent for them as well. She raised generations on a diet of pure, cultivated animosity. The war became their inheritance, an heirloom of hate passed from father to son, its origins shrouded in the mists of time but its purpose as clear and as sharp as a blooded dagger. 40 years. An entire lifetime had eroded since the quiet night in Galswintha's chambers. A generation had been born, lived, and died knowing nothing but the low, simmering fever of the Queen's War. The cause was now a distant echo, a story told to children, but the hatred it spawned was a living, breathing entity that stalked the halls of power. The passage of time had been etched onto the faces of the kingdoms. Fields had been sown and harvested 40 times, castles had been built and besieged, alliances had been forged in marriage and shattered by murder. The conflict had become a part of the landscape, as permanent and as grim as the gallows that stood at the crossroads. In Neustria, Friedgund grew old. The sharp edges of her beauty softened into a mask of regal authority, but the flint in her eyes remained. She had outlasted all her early rivals, her throne built on a foundation of carefully chosen bones. Her mind remained a steel trap, a maze of plots and counterplots that had kept her alive and in power for 4 decades. She did not die by the dagger or by poison, the instruments she had so expertly wielded against others. No assassin crept into her chambers. No rival queen orchestrated her end. Her death came as a slow, peaceful tide, a gentle gathering of the shadows in her own well-guarded bed. It was a death she had denied to so many. She died a queen, surrounded by the emblems of her success. Her son, Clothar II, was a man grown, the undisputed heir to a kingdom she had unified through terror and will. Her final breath was one of contentment. She had won. Her bloodline was secure. Her work was done. She left behind a legacy of fear, but also one of strength. The year was 597. Friedgund, the servant girl who had waded through blood to a throne, was laid to rest in the great basilica in Paris, eulogized as a great and pious queen. Her tomb was magnificent, her name honored. History, for the moment, was written by the victor, and her victory seemed absolute. The news of her rival's death reached Brunhilde in Austrasia. There was no elation, no sense of triumph. It felt like the final stone of a great archway crumbling to dust, leaving only an empty space against the sky. The target of a lifetime of hatred was simply gone. It was an end without a climax, a victory by default that tasted only of ashes. Brunhilde had survived. By that simple, brutal metric, she was the winner. She stood now at the apex of her power, an ancient, terrifying matriarch who had ruled as queen, then as regent for her son, and now as regent for her two grandsons. Her will was the iron law of Austrasia and Burgundy. No one dared to defy her. But the price of this survival was etched into every line on her face, in the deep, haunted shadows beneath her eyes. She was an edifice of power built on a foundation of personal loss. The war had taken everything from her but the throne itself, leaving it a cold and lonely seat. She was a shepherd who had sacrificed her entire flock to save the pasture. Around her were only ghosts. Her husband Sigebert, a distant memory of a life before the long winter of her hatred. His face was a faded tapestry, the men she had loved now less real than the men she had spent a lifetime avenging. His tomb was the cornerstone of her entire existence, a cold monument to a purpose that had consumed her. Her son, Childebert, the boy she had rescued and filled with her own venom, was also dead. He had fought her wars, carried her hatred as his own, and died in his prime, leaving his own two young sons in her care. She had molded him into a weapon, and the weapon had broken, leaving her to continue the fight alone. Now her grandsons, Theudebert and Theoderic, ruled their separate kingdoms under her watchful eye. She had repeated the process, pouring the same poison into their ears, teaching them that Fredegund's son was their hereditary foe. But her constant interference in their grandmother's iron grip began to chafe. They saw not a protector, but a tyrant. The very children she had raised to be instruments of her vengeance began to turn on each other, instigated by the whispers of nobles weary of her endless rule. The war had become so ingrained that when the primary enemy was distant, it simply found new targets closer to home. Her own grandsons became rivals, their armies clashing. She stood alone in the vast, echoing halls of her palace, a museum of her failures. Every tapestry depicted a battle that had cost her a loved one. Every jeweled cup had been a potential vessel for poison. Every shadow in every corner was a reminder of the assassins she had dispatched, and the ones she had feared. One evening, she stood before a silver mirror, just as she had done 40 years before. The young, determined face of the avenger was gone, replaced by a ruin. She saw a web of wrinkles, a downturned mouth that had forgotten how to smile, and eyes that had witnessed the death of everyone she was meant to protect. The reflection showed her not a queen, but a monster. In her long, relentless war against the monster in Neustria, she had adopted all of its methods. She had used the dagger, the poison, the lie. She had sacrificed family and followers with the same cold calculus. The face in the mirror was no longer her own, it was the face of her enemy. Friedgund had died warm in her bed, her legacy secure in her living son. Brunhilde was alive, but surrounded by a graveyard of her own making. She had outlived her rival, but she had also outlived her purpose, her love, and her own humanity. This was her victory. A cold, silent throne in a kingdom of ghosts. The year was 613. 16 years had passed since Fredegund's peaceful death, years that had not brought peace to Brunhilde. They had only brought more war, more graves. Her grandsons, the heirs she had raised on a diet of vengeance, had turned that cultivated hatred upon each other and were now both dead, casualties of their own inherited conflict. She was now 80 years old. An ancient relic from a forgotten age, her body bent and stooped with the weight of her years and her crimes. She ruled as regent for her great-grandson, Sigebert II, a boy of 10. But her authority, once as unyielding as iron, was rusted through with the fatigue and resentment of her subjects. The nobles of Austrasia and Burgundy, whose fathers and grandfathers had fought her wars, were tired. They were tired of the endless bloodshed, the crippling taxes, the iron will of a foreign queen who seemed to view their sons as mere kindling for the dying embers of her personal feud. Their loyalty had been worn down to a fragile, brittle thread. A quiet consensus formed in the shadows of the court. The architect of their misery was not Clothar II, the son of their old enemy, but the ancient woman who clung to power with a skeletal grip. Clothar represented unity, an end to the civil wars. Brunhilde represented only the past, a past soaked in Frankish blood. Warnachar, the mayor of the palace in Burgundy, and Arnulf, a powerful bishop from Metz, became the quiet leaders of this new sentiment. They sent secret emissaries to Clothar. They did not offer battle. they offered a kingdom. They would abandon the old queen, deliver her army, and recognize him as the sole king of all the Franks. The betrayal was as swift and silent as a dagger in the back. As Clotho advanced with his Neustrian army, Brunhilde gathered her own forces to meet him. She stood before her soldiers, a shrunken figure in regal robes, attempting to ignite in them the fires that had long since turned to ash within herself. She gave the order to advance. No one moved. The army stood silent, their banners limp in the still air. They did not lower their spears in surrender, they simply refused to raise them in her name. Her generals looked away, their faces grim masks of finality. The thread of loyalty had snapped. In that deafening silence, Brunhilde understood that her long reign was over. She was utterly alone. Her army, her kingdom, the very world she had shaped for over half a century, had abandoned her. She was captured without a fight, not as a queen surrendering, but as a fugitive being run to ground. She was no longer a monarch, but a problem to be disposed of, the final obstacle to appease everyone but her now craved. They brought the old queen, bound and cloaked in dust, before the men she had been taught to despise since birth. Clotho II, Fredegund's son, sat on a makeshift throne in his military camp. His face was unreadable, his eyes holding the cold, flat light of a winter morning. He did not look upon a defeated enemy, but upon a historical reckoning. He was the embodiment of the war she had nurtured. Every loss in his life, every battle his father had fought, every fear his mother had harbored, led to this moment. He saw before him not a frail, 80-year-old woman, but the source of the poison that had sickened the Frankish kingdoms for 2 generations. His judgment would be a cauterizing of that wound. He did not speak to her. He spoke to his assembled army, his voice ringing out over the silent field. He accused her of the death of 10 kings of the Franks. The list was a litany of her life's work, her husband, her son, her grandsons, his own father and brothers. He made her the sole author of all their suffering, a monstrous scapegoat for 60 years of strife. For 3 days, she was subjected to a ritual of humiliation. The once great queen, the correspondent of popes and emperors, was paraded through the camp, mounted backward on a camel. The soldiers jeered and spat, their contempt a final, brutal verdict. Her body, already frail, was broken by torment, but her spirit, encased in a lifetime of pride, remained unbowed. On the 3rd day, they brought her to a wide, stony field. The entire army was assembled in a great circle, a silent amphitheater for the final act. In the center, a horse waited. It was a wild stallion, powerful and unbroken, its eyes rolling with fear and aggression. It was a creature of pure, untamed violence. They dragged her forward. Her long white hair, once her vanity, was now a tangled, dirty mat. They took a rope and tied it to a thick lock of her hair. They tied another rope to her ankle. The other ends of the ropes were fastened securely to the tail of the wild horse. She was now physically bound to the chaos she had helped unleash upon the world. A soldier stood ready with a spear. Clotho gave a signal, a slight, almost imperceptible nod of his head. The soldier jabbed the stallion's flank. The animal screamed, a sound of pure fury and pain, and exploded into a gallop. It tore across the field, a black thunderbolt dragging a tattered shred of humanity behind it. The end was instantaneous and absolute. Her body was smashed against the rocks, torn apart by the animal's frantic speed. What had once been a queen, a mother, a plotter of intricate vengeances and a ruler of kingdoms, was reduced to a spray of red on the unforgiving earth, a broken thing left in the dust of a horse's fury. The army watched in a profound, horrified silence. The war was over. The feud was finished. Clotho II was now the undisputed king of a united realm, his mother's ultimate victory secured. But as the dust settled on the empty field, it was clear that no one had truly won. The only victor was death itself, which, after 40 long years, had finally gathered its bountiful and terrible harvest.